Jim Thompson had always enjoyed the peace of his home, tucked away at the end of a quiet street, where the only sounds were the rustling of leaves in the wind and the occasional hum of his restored 1972 Chevrolet Chevelle's engine. The car, his pride and joy, was a labor of love. He'd spent countless hours perfecting every detail, from the gleaming chrome to the deep red paint, and it was a symbol of everything he valued: hard work, patience, and a love for the finer things in life. His driveway, where the Chevelle sat proudly, was his sanctuary, a place where he could just be himself, away from the world. That was until the afternoon everything changed. Jim was enjoying a quiet afternoon in his living room when he glanced out the window, and his peace shattered. Standing in the middle of his driveway was a woman in a bright green tracksuit, yelling into her phone with an air of confidence that immediately put him on edge. Nearby, a tow truck idled, its driver unsure, clearly caught in the middle of whatever was unfolding. As Jim's eyes locked onto his car, his stomach dropped. The tow truck was about to hook up his prized Chevelle. His heart rate quickened. There was no way this was happening. His car was parked legally, perfectly within the lines of his driveway, not blocking anyone or anything. But as he stepped outside to confront the situation, the woman's smug expression told him this wasn't some mistake. She was doing this on purpose. "Excuse me," Jim called out, his voice calm but firm. "What do you think you're doing?" The woman turned, a look of amusement flickering across her face as she caught sight of him. "Oh, there you are," she said, as if he were the intruder. "This car is parked illegally, and I'm having it removed." Jim's jaw tightened. This wasn't happening. This was his driveway, and that was his car. No one had the right to just take it. "This is my driveway," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "And that's my car. It's not breaking any laws." She rolled her eyes as if he were a child who simply didn't understand the rules. "Actually, this is a shared driveway," she said, pointing to the narrow path leading from the street to his garage. "And your car is in violation of HOA regulations." Jim blinked in disbelief. He'd done his homework when he bought the house. The driveway was private property, not a shared space, and the HOA had no authority over his land. Yet here she was, trying to twist the narrative. "I don't know who you are or where you're getting this from, but you can't just tow someone's car because you feel like it," Jim said, his voice rising slightly with frustration. "Oh, I can," she shot back, standing her ground with crossed arms. "And I will. You see, your car has been causing problems for the whole neighborhood. It's too loud, too old, and frankly, it's an eyesore. We're trying to keep the neighborhood respectable." That was it. Jim could feel his blood boiling. It wasn't just the absurdity of her claim, it was the arrogance in her voice, like she had the authority to dictate what cars could be parked in his own driveway. "This car is none of your business," he said sharply, trying to stay composed. "Now I suggest you leave before I call the police." She let out a mocking laugh, her eyes glinting with that same smugness. "Oh, please. Call the cops," she taunted. "I'd love to explain how your car is violating HOA rules." Jim turned to the tow truck driver, who was standing uncomfortably by his vehicle, looking like he didn't want to be involved. "You know this is illegal, right?" Jim asked, stepping toward him. "You can't tow a car off private property without the owner's consent. Especially not when it's perfectly legal." The driver hesitated, shifting uneasily from one foot to the other. "Look, lady," he said to the woman, "I don't want any trouble. Are you sure this is okay?" Karen, because now Jim had decided, in his mind, that she had to be a Karen, snapped, "It's fine. I've already called the HOA president. They approved it. Just do your job." Jim's patience was running out. He stepped directly between Karen and his car, staring her down. "The HOA doesn't own this property," he said firmly. "And if you so much as touch this vehicle, I will make sure you regret it." For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. Karen's smirk faltered, her confidence shaken for the first time since she'd arrived. There was a brief flicker in her eyes, frustration, maybe even doubt, but she quickly recovered, stabbing a finger in his direction. "You'll regret this," she hissed before turning on her heel, storming off. The tow truck driver, clearly relieved to be out of the situation, mumbled an apology to Jim before following her down the street. Jim stood there, heart still pounding, watching as they drove away. But deep down, he knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The next morning, Jim stood in his kitchen, sipping his coffee as he glanced out the window. The street was quiet, the sun shining down, but the unease from the day before still lingered. He had hoped it was over, that Karen's attempt to tow his car would be the extent of her overreaching. But as the hours passed, it became increasingly clear that he was wrong. The first sign came when he stepped outside to grab the newspaper. As he approached his front door, he noticed something on the ground, a letter, not an envelope but a notice, printed on official-looking HOA letterhead. Jim's stomach dropped as he bent down to pick it up. The letter was vague, almost too vague. It read, "This is your final warning to remove the unapproved vehicle from your driveway. Failure to comply will result in further action." No signature. No contact number. Just the HOA logo slapped at the top, making it look like a real violation notice. Jim stared at it, disbelief creeping in. He had checked. His property was outside of the HOA's jurisdiction. His driveway was private property, not shared. The more he looked at the notice, the more he realized it was a blatant fabrication, something that could have easily been printed off a template. Karen had been behind this. She had to be. Frustration bubbled inside him, but Jim wasn't about to back down. He knew exactly what this was, an attempt to bully him into moving his car for good. It wasn't just about the car anymore. It was about Karen trying to exert control over him, using whatever means she could. The next few days were filled with more of the same. Every time Jim went outside, he felt her eyes on him. It was as if Karen was always lurking in the shadows, waiting for a chance to strike. Arms folded, eyes locked on his driveway, she stood across the street, a permanent fixture in his peripheral vision. It wasn't subtle. It was stalking, pure and simple. Every time Jim stepped outside, she was there, observing him as if waiting for him to make a misstep. "She's obsessed," Jim muttered to himself, pacing around the house. She wasn't just some nuisance neighbor, this was getting dangerous. She wasn't going to let it go. The harassment was getting personal. Jim knew that he needed proof, something more solid than his word against hers. He installed a security camera above his garage, angling it to catch the driveway from every angle. If Karen was going to keep escalating, he was going to be ready. The very next day, his suspicions were confirmed. Another notice appeared, this time, stuck directly onto his windshield. It was a notice of violation with a $500 fine attached. The letter claimed that his car was still in violation of community standards, and he had 48 hours to remove it. Jim laughed bitterly. Karen wasn't even pretending anymore. She was pulling out every tactic she could find to get rid of him. He wanted to tear the letter up right there, but he knew better. This wasn't just about fines anymore, it was about harassment, and the HOA was complicit. The harassment continued with staged complaints. A few days later, an inspector showed up at Jim's door. Someone had called in a report saying his car was abandoned. The inspector walked around, inspecting Jim's pristine vehicle like it was some kind of crime scene. The inspector clearly wasn't fooled. After a few moments of inspecting the car, he simply nodded and said, "I don't see any issue here. It's clearly not abandoned. I'll be on my way." The inspector left without issuing any violation, but Karen's influence was still felt. Then came the noise complaint, another call made to the local authorities, claiming that Jim's car was disturbing the peace. The thing was, Jim hadn't driven it in over a week. But that didn't matter. The point wasn't that the complaints were baseless. The point was that Karen was willing to do whatever it took to wear him down. One evening, just as Jim was about to head to bed, he heard something outside, a faint clink, like metal tapping against metal. His stomach twisted. He grabbed his phone and crept to the window, peering out through the blinds. His heart nearly stopped when he saw her. Karen. She was crouching by his car, a pair of bolt cutters in her hands. Jim's pulse quickened. He didn't think twice. Throwing open the door, he stormed outside, his voice a sharp command, "Hey! What the hell do you think you're doing?" Karen jumped up, startled. The bolt cutters dangled in her hands, like a weapon. She quickly regained her composure, putting on a feigned expression of innocence. "I was just checking something," she said, her tone smooth, almost mocking. "Checking what?" Jim demanded, his voice barely containing his rage. "Making sure your car isn't leaking oil all over the driveway." Karen's eyes flickered briefly, but she wasn't backing down. She crossed her arms and shot him a defiant look. "You're not allowed to park this here," she said, her voice dripping with smugness. "I'm just making sure it's compliant with HOA rules." Jim's fists clenched at his sides. He could feel the anger rising in him. "This is private property," he growled, stepping closer. "You have no authority here." Karen didn't respond, but her silence spoke volumes. She didn't back down. Instead, she gave him one last condescending smile before turning and storming off, disappearing into the night. Jim stood there, his breath coming heavy, fists still clenched. This wasn't just harassment. It was war. And he wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. The tension in the air around Jim's house was palpable. Every day felt like walking a fine line, knowing that at any moment, Karen might escalate things further. After the bolt cutter incident, Jim was more determined than ever to get concrete proof of her harassment, but he never expected things to go as far as they did. It started like any other morning. Jim stepped outside to grab his mail, and there it was, a new note on his windshield. He squinted at it, holding it up to the light. Another notice of violation, claiming his car was a nuisance and that it was breaking HOA rules. This time, the letter wasn't just a fine, it threatened to tow the car if it wasn't moved within 24 hours. Jim could feel his blood pressure rising as he read through it. The absurdity of it all was suffocating. He stared at his car, the same beautiful Chevelle he had spent years restoring, sitting perfectly parked in his private driveway. Not a single inch out of line. Yet, Karen was still out there, trying to use the HOA as a weapon to bully him into submission. Jim had had enough. He reached for his phone and, this time, he wasn't playing around. He was going to get a restraining order. He didn't care what Karen or the HOA thought anymore. The law was on his side, and he was going to make sure she understood that. But just as Jim was about to make the call, something stopped him. He had a sinking feeling in his gut, a sense of impending disaster that had been building for days. The small noises outside had been increasing, things moving, footsteps creeping in the dark. He walked over to the window and looked outside. His stomach dropped. Karen was standing in his driveway. Not alone, though. She had two men with her. They were dressed in dark clothing, their faces partially obscured, moving carefully toward his car. Jim could barely believe what he was seeing. One of the men had a crowbar in his hand. The other was carrying something Jim couldn't quite make out in the low light. A wave of panic hit Jim. This wasn't a petty complaint anymore. This was an attack, and it was happening in real time. His fingers trembled as he grabbed his phone and dialed 911. His heart raced as he whispered into the receiver, "I need help. Someone is trying to damage my property." The dispatcher's calm voice reassured him as she promised help was on the way, but he couldn't wait. He had to act. Jim grabbed his keys and headed out the door, fury rising inside him. He couldn't let this go any further. As he walked down the driveway, he saw the man with the crowbar raise it above the car's hood. Before he could swing, Jim shouted, "Hey!" The two men froze for a split second, their eyes locking with Jim's. He was only a few feet away, but the air felt thick, tense. The man with the crowbar slowly lowered it, stepping back as he looked to Karen for direction. "What do you think you're doing?" Jim demanded, trying to keep his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "You can't just walk onto my property and destroy my car." Karen, standing behind the men, sneered. "You've made a mistake, Jim," she said with a cold smile. "You're a thorn in my side, and I'm done asking nicely." The man with the crowbar took a step forward again, but Karen quickly stepped in front of him, raising her hand as though she were the one in charge. "It's too late for talking," she said. "We're just doing what needs to be done. Your car doesn't belong here." Jim's hand tightened into a fist. He knew this was no longer just about his car. This was about his rights, and Karen was crossing a line. "I'm calling the police," Jim said, stepping forward with authority. Karen stepped back, her face contorting in rage. "Call them," she snapped. "They won't do anything, Jim. You've already pissed off the HOA, and I've made sure they're on my side." Before Jim could respond, he heard the sound of sirens in the distance. Help was coming, but he didn't know if it would be fast enough. The two men, realizing they were losing the upper hand, started to back away slowly, still eyeing Jim warily. Karen, however, stood her ground, glaring at Jim with contempt. "This isn't over," she hissed, her voice low and venomous. "You'll regret this." Jim could see the men hesitating, unsure of whether they should push forward or retreat. They exchanged uneasy looks, sensing the approaching police. They backed off, dropping the crowbar and gas can before making a quick retreat with Karen trailing behind. As they disappeared down the street, Jim stood there, his chest heaving with the weight of what just happened. He couldn't believe what he had just witnessed. Karen wasn't just harassing him anymore, she was trying to destroy him, to take everything from him. When the police arrived, Jim explained everything, showing them the footage from his security cameras. The officers were stunned. This was more than just an angry neighbor, it was a deliberate act of intimidation and vandalism. The next day, Jim received the full extent of Karen's damage. His car had been vandalized, deep scratches, dents, and a shattered windshield. It wasn't just about a little rage, this was malice. Karen had crossed the line, and Jim was done playing defense. As the police began their investigation, Jim felt the weight of the battle ahead of him. But now, he wasn't just fighting for his car, he was fighting for his life, for his home, and for his freedom from a tyrant. The war had just begun. The weeks that followed the vandalism were a blur of frustration, paperwork, and anger. Karen had crossed a line, and Jim wasn't about to let her get away with it. The police had opened an investigation, and though Jim felt confident that they would catch her for the damage, the unease never quite left him. There was a palpable tension in the air now, something dark hanging over his house like a storm cloud. Jim had filed a formal police report, but Karen was still out there, still watching him. He couldn't shake the feeling that she was planning something more, something worse. Every time he looked out the window, it felt like her eyes were on him, a constant reminder that this wasn't just a petty squabble over a car. This was a war, and she wasn't about to back down. That night, Jim barely slept. He tossed and turned, the sound of his car alarm going off in his mind, over and over again. His Chevelle had been through enough. He had put everything into restoring it, blood, sweat, and countless hours. The last thing he wanted was for her to destroy it completely, but deep down, he knew she would try again. The next morning, Just as he was about to head out for a meeting, Jim heard it, a faint noise in the distance, a slight scraping sound. He froze. The last time he heard something like this, it was Karen and her accomplices damaging his car. His stomach sank. He rushed to the window and peered outside. There it was. Karen stood at the end of his driveway, her arms folded, a smug smile on her face. But this time, she wasn't alone. Two men stood beside her, wearing dark clothes. One of them held a crowbar. The other had a large gasoline can in his hands. Jim's blood ran cold. This wasn't just vandalism anymore, this was arson. His heart raced as he grabbed his phone and dialed 911. His voice was calm but urgent as he relayed the details. "I have two men on my property with a crowbar and a gas can," he said. "They're about to destroy my car." The dispatcher assured him help was on the way, but Jim didn't wait. He couldn't. He grabbed a baseball bat from the garage and marched down the driveway, his footsteps heavy in the silence. The tension in the air was suffocating, every nerve in his body alert. As he reached the end of the driveway, the two men stopped in their tracks. Jim could see their eyes flick to Karen, who was standing behind them, watching the scene unfold with an expression of cold satisfaction. He wasn't about to let them finish what they started. "What do you think you're doing?" Jim called out, his voice steady but full of anger. The man with the crowbar looked up, his expression unreadable, but his body language told Jim everything. They weren't just going to damage the car, they were about to burn it to the ground. The man with the crowbar stepped forward, brandishing it like a weapon. "Get out of the way," he muttered, his voice low. "No," Jim shot back, his grip tightening on the bat. "This is my property. And I won't let you destroy it." Before he could say anything else, Karen spoke up from behind them, her voice dripping with venom. "You should have stayed out of my way, Jim. You've made this personal. I'm going to make sure you regret it." Jim didn't have time to process her words. The man with the crowbar made a move, but Jim swung the bat, knocking the crowbar out of his hand. The man stumbled back, but it was the other man with the gasoline who was the real threat. He took a step toward the car, the gas can still in his hand. In a split second, Jim knew what he had to do. He lunged at the man, knocking the gas can out of his hands before it could spill onto the pavement. The can clattered to the ground, and the man scrambled to grab it, but Jim was already moving. He didn't hesitate. "Leave now, or I'll call the police," Jim threatened, pointing the bat at the men. They looked at each other, calculating their options, but they knew they'd been caught. The sirens were getting closer. The men dropped the crowbar and gas can and bolted, disappearing down the street before the police could arrive. Jim stood there, his chest heaving as he stared after them. It was over, for now, but he knew this wasn't the last of it. Karen wasn't done. She wouldn't stop until she got what she wanted. He was no longer just dealing with a neighbor who wanted him to move his car. He was up against a woman who would go to any lengths to tear his life apart. As the police arrived, Jim quickly explained what had happened, showing them the footage from his security cameras. The officers were incredulous, but they took the details down, and soon they were on their way to track down Karen's two accomplices. But it wasn't just the police Jim needed anymore. Karen had escalated the situation so far that Jim realized the true extent of her madness. She wasn't just a petty, vindictive neighbor, she was a threat, and he had no choice but to fight back. That night, as Jim locked his doors and double-checked the security cameras, he couldn't help but feel like this was only the beginning. Karen had already gone too far. But Jim had nothing left to lose, and he was done letting her control his life. This wasn't just about a car anymore. This was about survival. And Jim wasn't going to let Karen win. Days passed, but the weight of the battle never seemed to lift. Jim knew Karen was still out there, plotting her next move. The thought of what she might do next gnawed at him. He had already witnessed her escalating from petty complaints to outright vandalism and now, even attempted arson. He thought the worst was over, but something in his gut told him she wasn't done yet. He'd already made it clear that he wasn't going to back down, but he knew, deep down, that Karen's final attempt at revenge would be her most dangerous one yet. It started with an envelope. Jim didn't think much of it at first when he found it slipped under his door, but when he tore it open, his stomach twisted. A certified letter from the HOA, stamped with urgency and signed by the president. The letter stated that Jim's property was in serious violation of HOA regulations and that he was to remove his car immediately, or further legal actions would be taken, including potential forfeiture of his property. Jim's blood ran cold. His driveway was private, and his property had never been under the HOA's jurisdiction. But the more he read the letter, the more he understood. Karen had used her influence with the HOA to target him, even going so far as to forge documents to make the violations look legitimate. This was no longer just about a car, it was about driving Jim out. She was willing to go to any length, to use any means necessary to make his life a living hell. Furious, Jim took immediate action. He hired a lawyer, gathered evidence, and filed a formal complaint against the HOA. His lawyer quickly uncovered that Karen's complaints were not only fabricated but part of a larger scheme to leverage her HOA connections to ruin his life. The HOA president had known about Karen's lies, but had been too afraid of the backlash to step in. Just when Jim thought things couldn't get worse, he received a new letter, a real eviction notice, claiming his property was in violation of neighborhood standards and that he needed to vacate his home immediately. Jim's world turned upside down. He couldn't believe that after all the time he had spent fighting to keep his car, he was now fighting to keep his house. Karen had gone further than he thought possible, attempting to destroy his livelihood. But this was Jim's breaking point. He wasn't going to let Karen win, not this time. Armed with his lawyer and the power of hard evidence, he demanded a meeting with the HOA board. When the day came, Jim showed up with all the evidence, the forged documents, the email trail, and the video footage of Karen's attempts to ruin his property. The board, stunned by the sheer audacity of Karen's actions, apologized publicly and vowed to investigate further. The president, now fully aware of Karen's manipulations, pledged to disavow her completely, and the HOA issued a formal statement to the neighborhood acknowledging Karen's misuse of their resources. But that wasn't enough. Jim knew that Karen's vengeance wasn't over yet. His suspicions were confirmed one evening when, as he returned home, he saw a tow truck parked in front of his house. Karen was there, standing beside it, with a smirk on her face. She wasn't going to stop, she wanted to destroy him. But this time, Jim was ready. He stood firm, calling the police and once again, exposing Karen's abuse for what it was. The tow driver, realizing the situation, backed off. Karen's last attempt at revenge had failed. As the police took statements, Jim realized that the fight he had been waging for months had finally reached its conclusion. Karen was done. The neighbors, who had once been too afraid to stand up to her, now rallied around Jim, offering their support. And the HOA, once complicit in her schemes, had now been forced to act in favor of justice. It wasn't just a victory for Jim, it was a victory for the entire neighborhood, one where a tyrant had been exposed, and the power dynamics had shifted. The fear Karen had instilled in the community was shattered, and people were no longer afraid to live their lives freely. As Jim leaned against his car, a sense of satisfaction washed over him. He had fought for his home, his property, and his peace of mind. Karen's reign of terror had come to an end. But as the sun set on this chapter of his life, Jim couldn't help but wonder, what happens when a community is held hostage by one person's will? And how many more have experienced the same kind of abuse without standing up to it? Have you ever been pushed to the brink by a neighbor or HOA? Share your stories below. Let's talk about the real battles we face behind closed doors.